getting into the rookie running back production profiles. It's some good stuff. There's just, a really deep running back class. I've really enjoyed researching this running back class. And so here we go. Who's that running back? It's Zach Charbonnet. Zach Charbonnet produced 168 yards per game in 2022. I feel like this doesn't get talked up enough. I get that he's in the Pac-12, but when he's putting up 136 rushing yards per game out of his team's 240 total rushing yards, he's representing 57% of his team's rushing yards per game. That's monstrous workload. Okay, and so what I'm looking at here, I've got my charts. You can see we're looking at each player's rushing yards per game stacked with their receiving yards per game on average over 2022, their last college season, and then totaled here 168 total yards, and then a completely different scale, right? But we're comparing his team's rushing yards per game, receiving yards per game, total yards per game. So for UCLA last year, they were averaging 240 rushing yards per game, 266 receiving yards per game for a massive 506 total yards per game. Incredible. And one other thing we can look at. So right now we're looking at over here, Zach Charbonnet. We're going to be comparing his stats in 2022, his attempts per game at 19.5 rushing attempts per game. He's got the green light there. He's got the green in his box. We're comparing him to the benchmark target of 15 rushes per game. That is the scout, in my mind, and from research I've done, when scouts are looking at a running back and determining if he can handle an NFL workload, they look for 15 rushing attempts per game, at least, minimum, and 1.5 receptions per game. And Charbonnet has the green light in both of these areas. He's got 3.7 receptions per game. Incredible. So he's got over 23 touches per game out of his team's 61 either rushes or passing plays. So he's representing, well over a third of his team's touches per game. He's very productive. He's PFF category bell cow running back. All right. And I think we can see clearly why here. Another thing I wanted to point out, this table up here, this is 2022 FBS team data by percentile. And so by team percentile, we can look at the 90th percentile is 214 rushing yards per game. When we know that UCLA had 240 rushing yards per game, this star indicates UCLA was well above the 90th percentile for rushing yards per game as a team, where their attempts per game as a team were only just above the 70th percentile. To me, that indicates this was a highly, highly efficient rushing offense. They could generate more rushing yards per attempt than would be expected looking across the entire league. And if you can attribute that to their primary ball carrier, which 57% of the time was Zach Charbonnet, I think we've settled our case. We've got a bell cow rookie running back, Zach Charbonnet. Could he go in the first round? I don't think so. I think he goes probably in the second round, but I'm not a draft expert, and based on his production profile, I really like this guy. I want to draft him in fantasy football in all formats. Zach Charbonnet looks like a great prospect here. Okay, let's move on. I think that's all I wanted to say about this, but there's a lot of good data here, and we're going to move on to the next rookie. So let's go ahead and do that. Who's that running back? It's Kenny McIntosh. Kenny McIntosh, running back for the Georgia Bulldogs, last year produced 89 yards per game total, split between 55 rushing yards per game and 34 receiving yards per game over the 15 games he played, of course. When you compare this to his team's production, the team totaled 207 and 296 rushing and receiving yards per game, respectively, for a whopping 503 total yards per game. We all know that Georgia team was humming on offense. So that's what we're looking at here. We've got Kenny McIntosh, clear receiving game, right? He's got 34 out of his 89 yards per game coming from his reception work. And that's why PFF has him categorized as a running back by committee space back. Kenny McIntosh, compared to our benchmarks for scouting, if we're looking at college production compared to, if we project that into the NFL and if we think they can handle an NFL workload, our benchmarks are, again, 15 rushing attempts per game. Kenny McIntosh was splitting the workload. He was a committee back in Georgia. We can clearly see he was splitting his attempts, his yards per game with Edwards, with his other backs in the rotation at Georgia. So he didn't really get above that 15 carries per game threshold. And hey, what's up, peanut butter and waivers? What's going on? And so we're going through our rookie production profiles, college production profiles. Kenny McIntosh, right? Where he excels, it's the receptions per game. 2.9 receptions per game. Look at his team's receptions. He's making up 13% of his team's target share. I mean, that's incredible for a running back. And he clearly exceeds the benchmark 1.5 receptions per game with his productions last year. When you total him up, he actually gets to about 13 touches per game, which is pretty good. It's not quite at that 16.5 we'd want for a workhorse like a bell cow running back. Like we said, he's a space back. We look at what Georgia was doing last year. It's actually pretty interesting. Their attempts per game, they're at they're at 36 attempts per game, which was below the 50th percentile across the FBS last year, but their rushing yards per game was super efficient, right? So at 207 rushing yards per game over here, that's well above the 80th percentile for rushing yards. Overall, I think Kenny McIntosh has a chance to be a committee back and have fantasy impact pretty quickly. I've seen him, his receiving work is elite, and I think that's going to give him fantasy relevancy and NFL relevancy.